Good evening, and welcome to the second panel of our series in journalism, politics, and the 2020 election. My name is Nicole Dahmen, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Communication, and I'll be the host for this series. These conversations feature experts discussing key issues related to news, politics, and this historic period that we're all living through. From sports and social activism, which we'll be discussing this evening, to race and gender, and shared connections across rural and urban communities. We have designed this series for our SOJC students, the UO community, as well as for people across the state of Oregon. We're going to first turn to our panelists for a moderated discussion, and we hope that you use the Zoom Q&A feature for questions that you may have. We'll read audience questions at 5:45. This event is being recorded and will be made available on our SOJC YouTube channel. Our moderator for the series is Professor Seth Lewis. Professor Lewis is the founding holder of the Shirley Papay Chair in Emerging Media at the School of Journalism and Communication. He's a fellow with Columbia University, an affiliate fellow with Yale Law School, and a recent visiting fellow at Oxford at the University of Oxford. He's also the director of our journalism sequence at the Journalism School at the University of Oregon. Dr. Troy Elias is an associate professor in the advertising sequence. His research interests focus on diversity and equity, media effects, and attitudes related to climate change. His research helps organizations, brands, and journalists understand how to include and communicate with communities of color. At the University of Oregon, Dr. Elias has received the Best Faculty Award by UO's Student Athlete Committee and a mentorship award from the UO Black Women of Achievement Student Group. He's the faculty advisor for the UO student chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists. Laurie Shontz is a professor of practice at the SOJC, where she specializes in teaching writing and reporting. She's a nationally recognized leader in engagement journalism, which creates ways to strengthen the connections between journalists and the communities they cover for greater civic good. Professor Shontz came to academia after more than 2 decades as a writer and editor, specializing in women's sports, women's issues, and higher education. She's reported from Kenya, Cuba, 10 Final Fours, both women's and men's, and 4 Olympic Games. She also uses her background as a sports journalist to teach a class in advanced sports reporting here at the SOJC, covering all the track and field meets at Hayward Field, including the 2016 Olympic trials. Her students' work has been published in more than 30 professional publications since 2015. And joining our panel this evening is Jevon Holland, an ethnic studies major at the University of Oregon and a former Oregon Ducks football player. As a safety at UO, Jevon was the first Oregon player to lead the team in interceptions in 2 consecutive years since Jarius Byrd in 2006 and 2007. At one time, he was ranked as the #2 high school athlete in the state of California, and he was a Jim Thorpe Award finalist as a sophomore. In September of 2020, Jevon opted out of the 2020-2021 college football season to prepare for the NFL draft. Seth?
Hey, thank you, Nicole, and thanks to our panelists and to everyone who's joined us this evening. We really appreciate you all being here to take part in an incredibly important conversation as part of our webinar series. So tonight we'll be talking about some aspects of sports and social activism, and obviously we've seen a number of examples in that vein this year. I wonder if first to Troy and then Laurie, you can talk a bit about just what's happened this year. Help us understand maybe the context of some of these different moments of sports and social activism and kind of how they relate to broader issues of racial justice protests and so forth.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you, Seth and Nicole, for putting on this webinar and for inviting myself and my fellow panelists. This is a very important topic, and I'm really happy to be able to participate. So when we talk about social activism, we have seen some really interesting examples this year, some coming from expected places and others at unexpected points of origin. So for instance, there was Bubba Wallace, who successfully lobbied NASCAR to ban Confederate flags at raceways and in sanctioned events. Naomi Osaka, the US Open champion, who on a number of occasions, I believe at least 7 occasions, wore the names of victims of police brutality on her mask. The MLB, Major League Baseball, when I think of the Boston Red Sox placing a large billboard outside of Fenway Park, highlighting and speaking very boldly about supporting Black Lives Matter. And I'll be honest, and I'll speak for myself, I think the statement Black Lives Matter is a pretty low bar, but for significant parts of the population, it causes a lot of ruffled feathers. But critics, there were a number of critics that argued that, BLM has no place in sports. It's not it shouldn't be tied to Boston Red Sox. And they responded to that criticism by saying, no, we have documented cases of current and former athletes who have experienced, unfortunately, racist taunts and barbs, right? There's the NBA. And I don't think we can have this conversation without mentioning the WNBA as well. And so all of these really important sports teams and individuals that are a part of these teams have really engaged in creating opportunities for discussion. They have created contexts that allow people to, pursue opportunities to vote, and have really directed this conversation or taken charge of this conversation on issues of racial inequity taking place.
Yeah, it's no surprise. Troy and I have similar lists of what has happened. And again, thank you to everyone for putting this panel together. What I really love about this panel is that it doesn't shunt sports off into the corner, into the toy department, as it's been too often called. Sports are a major part of life in this country. And if treating them as we do the other parts of our culture is extremely important. And that's why I'm so honored to be a part of this group discussing this. It's interesting, social activism takes a lot of forms, right? So we see some people who are raising awareness, and that's something that with the t-shirts that you see, and you've seen for years and years in some of these leagues, particularly the WNBA, particularly NBA, a particularly moving and poignant one, I think this year was the Washington Mystics wearing a shirt with showed 7 bullet holes in the back. That's to make you uncomfortable. And I think that's something that I've been seeing more of this year, is that it's not just raising awareness for something, that it's trying to make you uncomfortable. And putting that into context of what's happening today, athletes and sports leagues have a real opportunity because so many people pay attention to them. Any student who's listening in right now has heard me say that covering sports is like getting your vegetables and your dessert at the same time. People pay attention because it's sports, but there's real serious issues going on there. One other thing I'd like to highlight is how the WNBA has handled Kelly Loeffler, who is a co-owner of the Atlanta Dream. She is a Republican senator as well. And she has been, she says she supports that Black Lives Matter, but not the political movement Black Lives Matter. She draws a line there. And the athletes of the WNBA, including the players on her team, have been extremely sophisticated in how they have reacted to that. They got together and decided they would not use her name when she came out and complained about this. That's working together, that's collective action, that's solidarity. The other thing they did was that they researched her opponents, and they found an opponent, Dr. Raphael Warnock, and they didn't just endorse him or say something. They met with them and they talked with him. And then what they did is they came out with shirts that said "Vote Warnock." And that is a direct form of action that I don't think we've seen very often in the sports world, that in not just activist, but political. So I just find, I can't, you can spend all day looking at the sports news. There's so much going on.
For sure. And I'd like to come back and talk a bit about kind of the history of activism in sports a little later on. Lori, you brought up something that I think is really important, which is this idea of, sports somehow being a world apart from politics and activism and so forth. And we've heard the refrain, stick to sports, used, right, for many years. But I think this year especially, that's been kind of a critique that has been leveled, is that, hey, why aren't they just sticking to sports? And Jevon, I wonder if you might talk to us a bit about kind of your experience when people say, hey, just stick to football. what's your response? What's your reaction to that? And what do you think that, how do you think other athletes feel about those sort of attitudes?
And initially, when people usually say that, I usually find myself chuckling or laughing. It's just, it's a terrible mindset to have, to try to, pigeonhole somebody into one category. Knowing that that person probably has other interests, other, ambitions and things that they want to get into in their life that are outside of the sport that they play. You know what I mean? Regardless if you just love the sport, and you identify yourself as that. I identify myself as a football player. I have, many other things that I'm talented at and that I look for into doing life. So I think that for people to say that, it, boils a fire underneath athletes like myself to, use my voice, because I have a platform, because I have, all these followers on social media, and I'm very active on social media, and I want to not, I wouldn't say I want to like scold them or anything like that, but educate them, because that's, the most important thing. If someone has a different opinion of mine, I want to listen and find a common ground so that we both can agree to disagree, or, maybe he changes my mind, maybe I change their mind, things like that. But for somebody to say, shut up and play, like many people have, I think that's very disrespectful. And it's just not, it's inhumane to say that, because they're obviously, people first before they're said athlete or whatnot.
Right. And you touched on social media. Go ahead, Lori. Yeah, fire away.
Yeah, I just want to kind of interrogate a little bit of what our idea of political is, right? So what, this is political to speak for racial justice? And, we've been singing God Bless America in the seventh innings of baseball games since 9/11. Is that not political? We have been having this, the set of NFL Today goes and does a show from West Point, or you have these reunions at halftime with a soldier coming in to reunite with families. That's political as well. And I don't hear people saying stick to sports when it's that level. And I think that, it's an inconsistency in how we deal it. And it's also, where's the dominant narrative? Who's telling that narrative? And how is this considered something extra? As Jevon says, why is this not humane? The same way that we've had these other conversations that are never rarely, I should say, explicitly labeled as political or activist.
I think a lot of the time, like hearing it now, when people hear that, or when Black Lives Matter, or situations that don't involve that said people, when it comes to them in that environment, they get uncomfortable. And so that's what they rely on, and is that reaction to say, like, keep politics out of this. Like, we don't want to hear anything about that. You know what I mean? But it's okay when the president brings it to his attention and says something and speaks up about it. Now everybody's like, yeah, like, we want to play now. But before it was keep politics out of it. So why is he speaking up, in for the Big 10 or the Big 12 type thing? So, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like it's keeping inconvenient politics out, right? The inconvenient things that people might not want to confront. Troy?
May I add to this? I think it's also really important saying that, and to build off of what Jevon was saying, athletes are complete individuals. They have ties to their communities. When we think of, for instance, just the concept of race, right? We're talking about people who have, so just to be clear, race is an illegitimate sort of scientific concept. It doesn't really exist. There are as much differences within racial categories as there are between them. But there are certain social and political consequences to being ascribed a certain racial category, right? So race, when we look at people and they have certain physical characteristics, the fineness or coarseness of hair, the color of your eyes or the shape of your eyes, your skin complexion, skin tone, those are things that people make certain decisions on. And those decisions impact individuals, whether they make $1 million a year or whether they make $1 a year. And so it's really almost impossible to separate yourself from a variable that has such significant impact on all of our lives.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe Troy, could you just kind of build on that a little bit and talking about how just the role of race in particular as kind of just a key flashpoint in relation to kind of these questions around social justice. I mean, clearly, a lot of this was it's not like it's new, right? Like these things have been, these concerns have been going on for some time, but you know, the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and these other kind of, you know, key pivotal moments of police violence that really came to the fore and then triggered protests around the country in May and June seem to have kind of started a wave of unrest that we're seeing now, and just sort of concern that, of course, is sort of rippling through all of society, including sports, including this domain. And to Jevon's point earlier, what at least two things seem to be very different today, right? One is that athletes like yourself, Jevon, and professional athletes, college athletes alike, have a large social media followings, right? So you have a platform, you have people to speak directly to without needing to kind of go through traditional gatekeepers of journalists or sports information directors and so forth. That's one thing. And then I think the other is just a sense that now, you know, we're much more willing to talk about, I mean, politics feels like it's in everything nowadays, and sort of questions of activism. We're just much more willing, I think, to engage collectively with some of these, you know, topics that maybe we wanted to somehow just segment apart. And then there are other factors as well, I'm sure, but maybe Troy, you want to take that, and anybody else who want to chime in on that?
So I will say that for most of us that have been involved in conversations around activism and race and equity, I think, well, particularly those that are my age and older, were somewhat caught off guard by just how rapidly these conversations took a hold in mainstream America with the death of George Floyd. I think that was a tipping point that, you know, we have seen numerous examples of police brutality. We have seen Black bodies being, you know, documented, they're victims of violence. But for whatever reason, that really brought America together. And you started seeing within a 2-week period, public opinion shifting left regarding criminal justice systems, Black Lives Matter, in a way that is really unparalleled, right? There are very few instances where we have seen public opinion shift that quickly over a controversial topic, right? And it was just a fascinating moment for the country. Unfortunately, those numbers now have regressed to where they were prior to George Floyd's passing, right? The majority of Americans still show support for Black Lives Matter, about 55%. But in June, that number had escalated to about 67% of the population, which is amazing, right? But yeah, this is kind of the environment that we're in. And I'm really interested to see what impact that has on the elections coming up.
I could build off of that too. You know, there's a lot of different type of media that we're talking about here. And with a public groundswell or support, you know, stuff gets confused because it all looks like it's housed in the same thing. But ESPN is a broadcast partner with some of these leagues. So they had their interest in what happens and how they're going to portray it from a broadcast partner perspective is very different from a journalistic perspective, which is ESPN also employs journalists who are somewhere else. And then you have this non-mediated social media where that athletes have a better way of going directly to the public that they didn't used to have. So there's a lot of movement in that space, and everybody's trying to figure out how to gauge it, right? So if you're a journalist on some level, you can print truth, or you can print, write, print, document, video, whatever you want to do. If you're a broadcast partner, you have to be much more careful about how you're going to talk about that in your pregame show, about what kind of images you're going to use during the game. So there's a lot of really complicated decisions being made. And that public opinion part that Troy is talking about is hugely important to that, because there are people gauging that as it happens. And I don't think we know where exactly that's going to wind up yet, but it's certainly fascinating to keep watching.
I will also say really quickly, there are some concerns of, personally that I hold, and I'm not trying to speak for the entire Black community or Black communities, but I do believe that it is problematic for networks like ESPN to try their best to highlight conversations about race and diversity during that time, and then once that period is over, go back to just reporting about sports and ignoring what is clearly a very important issue to a significant part of their athletic foundation.
Absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to add that I feel like a lot of the time with these, I would say trends, because we live in a very trendy type environment now. That's what it was. That's why you see a lot of the major companies, a lot of the major TV reporting companies speak up so fondly for the Black Lives Movement. But then now, as people's attention shifts to another situation, then everybody's now like not paying attention to it, even though it's still going on, it's still happening. It's just not trending anymore. So I think that's another factor.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Jevon, you're talking about something that's very apparent, right? We talked about this last week in our webinar about politics and news, and how the news cycle seems faster, more frenetic, seems to kind of turn over faster than ever, which certainly has some consequences when it comes to needing to talk about like real, lasting, enduring issues that need sustained attention over time. And Jevon, I wonder if you might tell us a bit about some of the athletes you look up to, who you feel like have really personified what it means to use the platform that you have as an athlete well, to kind of speak up on important issues, or can you point to anyone in particular, or any particular teams that you feel like really capture the essence of good examples in this particular moment?
Yeah, Colin Kaepernick, absolutely. I feel like I resonate with him the most, because I was personally ready to lay my whole career on the line for standing up for what was right. I said this before in an interview, that if my future was affected in playing football because I spoke up and tried to defend the people that didn't have a voice that I had, I was 100% okay with that. I have, like I said before, I have plenty of other things I like to do. So if that was affected, then, I guess that's my time now. I think I guess that, my time in this game is up. But Colin Kaepernick, absolutely. The way that he went about it, how he explained himself, explained the reason behind it, and even the idea of taking the knee, got it from the Army veteran. I think that was amazing also. And that was when I was in high school. And so, right off the bat, I started taking the knee along with him. And we had a similar webinar like this that I held in high school. But his whole demeanor and how he was supported and how he stands on what he believes in. I think that's amazing. And I'm gonna tell my kids about how he was a role model, how he's like, the second coming of Muhammad Ali, who was also another person that I look up to. So definitely those two, Muhammad Ali and Colin Kaepernick.
Fantastic. That's a good segue maybe to talk about some of the history in this area. Lori, do you want to just tell us a bit about kind of some history of sports and social activism that you think, may have kind of laid the groundwork for what we've seen this year?
Yeah, I can already tell we could have done this for double the time, so I'll try to just back off enough of the history so we get some of there. I want to focus on the 60s, actually, because it's a civil rights movement then and a civil rights movement now, and it fits right with what Jevon's talking about, in that, there's some individual athletes who make a sacrifice, and that starts the ball rolling. I mean, very much at the beginning of the 60s, there was this stick to sports mentality over and over and over again. And then you started to have some athletes, speak out. Muhammad Ali, absolutely one of them, someone who came back from the Olympics and, was treated so poorly in Louisville that he, legend has it that he threw his gold medal into the river. And that's how he felt about the country, and that's where he went. You have basketball players like Bill Russell, someone who was, really out front and outspoken talking about things. And here's the thing, they made people uncomfortable. And I think that's a really important thing to look at, that especially early on, that it was individual athletes taking individual risks. The Black Power salute at the 1968 Olympics with Tommie Smith and John Carlos, that came at great personal cost to them, that there was no professional track circuit. That was their big moment. They were thrown out of the Olympics. They were sent home. They got death threats. They had trouble getting jobs. John Carlos's wife died several years later by suicide. He said that was related to the stress that they had at that point. Ali, got his title stripped. He got 3 years away from the sport. I mean, this, in like Kaepernick, like at some level of personal cost. And then once that way's been cleared, more people see it. Younger athletes like Jevon notice this and they come forward. And as the 60s went on, you got more and more athletes who were willing to go out and take that risk. You know, some of the stuff you didn't notice is you didn't see the female athletes getting the same attention as the male athletes. Wyomia Tyus at the 68 Olympics, who was your 100-meter champion, she wore black shorts instead of her uniform shorts to support Carlos and Smith. No one talks about that. That kind of got, you know, there's an imbalance in who's covered and how they're covered. You know, what's happening now is that there was kind of a lull there, I guess. You could call them the Michael Jordan years. When I was teaching sports media and society, you could just mention Jordan and LeBron and take the whole class because everybody has an opinion. And there's that quote that's never been proven that he said it, was like Republicans buy sneakers too, that he didn't really think that he wanted to get involved in having something overtly political. And then now here we are coming through again, and you're starting to see athletes risk something. The difference at this point in history is that it's becoming more of a collective action, that the Bucks do something together and then the league responds by canceling games. That you start to see, you know, the WNBA, the first athletes who wore I Can't Breathe shirts or Black Lives Matter shirts, they were fined $500 by the league in 2016, and the teams were fined $5,000. Within 24 hours, those were rescinded. And they said, no, we don't give up being a human because we're an athlete. And now, 4 years later, the WNBA had a social justice council ready to go before the NBA, before other people. They had a very specific plan that went forward. They did studying. You know, there's two things that are striking. First of all, that it's advanced, and second of all, that it's so much the same. It's all the same issues that people were asking to be attended to in 1968 that we are asking again. People are asking again in 2020. And that's both just interesting from a journalistic and storytelling and point of view, and also just hugely frustrating. Like, where are we as society this many decades later?
I think just to build off of that, we as a society seem to romanticize the civil rights movement and the struggles of many athletes and what they've been able to accomplish. I think there's a quote that's been attributed to Jim Brown. I don't know if it actually came from him or not, where he allegedly says that Muhammad Ali didn't become America's favorite athlete until he lost his ability to speak, right? And so there's this love affair with comfort that we tend to have. There's this belief that our country or society bends towards this moral arc, you know, by default, you know, without having to actually embark in this process of fighting for what we want, right? And I think athletes have the ability to really make this this struggle much clearer, right? And you know, if you were to ask me, I think LeBron James is one of those that deserves a lot of consideration for all that he has done. His school that allows at-risk youth to gain college scholarships. He's built housing for people who are homeless, who have mental health disorders or drug issues. He also has now the More Than a Vote initiative that he's launched with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And so there are a lot of athletes individually doing some really great work.
Troy, if I could just stick with you for a moment. You study branding and advertising, and you know, one thing that Jevon mentioned is how, you know, in the summer when it was trending, right? Everybody was on the bandwagon, as it were. I mean, everybody had a statement, everybody had a plan, everyone had kind of a message that they wanted to kind of get out there in relation to Black Lives Matter and others, sort of justice more generally. What do you think about, you know, in addition to kind of just the sports realm, how is it obviously interfaces a lot with advertising and marketing and branding? What are we seeing there that's happening in connection with sports that you think has been interesting, that has either been hopeful or that has been concerning from your standpoint?
I think there's been a little bit of both, right? But I will start off with the hopeful cases. I think brands have the ability and the power to get things done in a way that our currently gridlocked political system does not. So I was talking to a colleague, Tom McDonald, 30-year advertising man, and he mentioned, he'd been thinking about, some ways with which brands could become much more effective or have a larger say. And he mentioned, what's more American than Coca-Cola? Well, voting, right? And so what if you had some of these brands that indicated, we recognize that the outcome of some of the initiatives that you're engaged in at a state level will lead to voter suppression. We can't speak to intentions, but the outcome appears to be voter suppression. If you continue along this line, then maybe we take our corporations, we take our headquarters, and we go to another state, right? And I think that has a lot of power behind it, a lot of potential for impact behind it. And what brands do, brands are very sensitive to consumers, right? And so in that respect, we can actually elicit change by speaking to consumers through the bullhorn that brands provide, right? There are a number of brands that have done a remarkably amazing job. So Ben and Jerry's, for instance, they have embraced criminal justice reform for a very long time, right? And so they have credibility that extends beyond the summer. There's Steakum, there's REI, Netflix. There are some companies that are really putting their money into a number of initiatives, Procter and Gamble, and then Reebok, Adidas, and Nike, right? And of course, I tend to have a bit of a problem with some of the networks like ESPN that actually profit significantly from segments of the population that are struggling with this particular topic or this particular issue.
Jevon, I wonder if we could come back to you for a minute to talk about how, we've seen college athletes really sort of gain more of a voice too in this process. Looking at like the Pac-12, for example, I think a month or two ago, when it was a question about what the football season might look like, the Pac-12 athletes kind of led the way in just, in advocating for better conditions, for safer conditions, particularly amid the virus. Can you talk a bit about kind of just what you see happening in the college athlete ranks and where you think that might be going as far as part of a larger push toward taking an activist stance as athletes at the college level as well as the professional level?
Yeah, I think the direction it's going, hopefully the classes underneath me and underneath my peers will kind of take up that fight, because at some point we're not going to be college athletes anymore. Before, if we were like in having this meeting in August, I would say that it's going in a great direction. I feel like with the season that was coming up and the turmoil in the country, it just added more light to the situation that we were in. We weren't really being considered essential workers, and we weren't being compensated as such, but we were being treated like them. And I felt that was wrong, and a lot of my other peers felt that was wrong. And so we just decided to speak up, because without us, they can't. If we don't play, then they can't get money, and then they, have issues. So basically, just understanding your power and how much you're worth. You know what I mean? But because the season ended, because they canceled the season, especially for the Pac-12, because they canceled the season, I feel like a lot of that steam kind of burnt out. And I knew that was going to happen, and I was upset because a lot of the people that were on board with us decided, when the season got brought back, their desire to play was higher than their desire to fight for what was right. You know what I mean? So, which I understood, and I wasn't going to force anybody to try to, stay on what path. They want to believe what they want to believe. I stood by what I said. I still don't, believe that the Pac-12 was taking into consideration, the grand scheme health of the players, because we see all around the country that teams are getting. Baylor just canceled their game because they got sick, and no one's really up in arms about this. Coach Orgeron said that his whole team had COVID, and I'm taken back by that, because I'm more concerned about the health of the players in the long run. These are my friends that are going to eventually have to deal with these these heart conditions, these health conditions that they're going to receive from this virus, because we really don't know as a country what it can affect and what it does to our body. And I think, you know, the COVID and the civil rights movement just added more fuel to people like me, athletes like me, who want to speak up for what's right and have a strong moral compass that was instilled in us as kids.
Can I just say what a difficult position that college athletes in particular are in as opposed to the pro athletes. I really salute Jevon and the other Pac-12 players who were brave enough to be vocal about this stuff. The level of courage it takes to do this when you are not a professional athlete, as opposed to someone whose scholarship is non-renewable potentially, who is in a very difficult position, that makes this hugely difficult. And it's one of the reasons that this trend toward from individual sacrifice to collective action is so interesting to me, because when you get the whole team together, or when you get a whole group together, there's more power in that. The college athletes have a huge amount of unrealized power in these conversations. And it's just been interesting to me to watch. You can look back to University of Missouri in 2015 during the Ferguson movement, when the football players said they were not going to play their game unless the university president was removed. And that is a really strong, powerful voice. You know, and there's pieces of this back in the 60s as well. It's San Jose State, where Harry Edwards, who was the intellectual force behind the Black Power movement in the 1968 Olympics, you know, the football team there got a game canceled because they were fighting for, and they wanted stuff like, you know, can we have more Black professors on campus? Can we have more things, you know, the same type of stuff that we don't have on college campuses and not inclusive enough today, they're asking for back in 68. But that it's that move to collective action and the move to working together. And that's extremely hard when you're at the peak of your athletic powers. Even now, with sports medicine so improved and with so many, you know, many resources to do things, your athletic peak is a pretty short amount of time in your life. So to decide whether you're going to spend that capital on your athletic performance or on this bigger picture something, that's, I mean, I don't even know how you make that choice. That's a hugely difficult choice and a hugely important one. And being able to balance it, I think, is really key.
So Lori, you were a sports journalist and you study, you know, sports journalism. And so tell us, what do you think of the news coverage of these issues for the past several months? How you know, what is it doing well? What is it not doing so well?
Well, one thing that really strikes me is that I went back and looked for more coverage of the Pac-12 United and that disappeared. There was coverage for about 10 minutes when it happened. And then after that, it was all about, but what are we going to do with the schedule when the Pac-12 comes back? Like which 6 games and which 7, what else? That's on sports journalists. If you are that focused on only what the schedule looks like or what the depth chart looks like, and you're not looking bigger picture at, hey, what happened to that athlete movement? Look, you've got to be asking those questions. Sports doesn't just happen on the field. And there are people doing a wonderful job on that. There are people who, you know, Howard Bryant has been doing some fantastic work for ESPN, especially in looking at this, at the role of police, right? That police were celebrated after 9/11 as heroes by sports. And now you've got people protesting. You've got Naomi Osaka's boyfriend wearing a defund the police shirt at the US Open. That's a real tension there. And, you know, we teach storytelling in the SOJC, and we talk about stories and tension in a story. My gosh, the tension you have there, we could be doing a much better job as an industry in understanding and telling those stories, I think. You know, one of the issues is that, you know, 85% of sports editors in this country are white, and most of them are male. And you just don't have, the people covering the sports do not reflect the people who play sports. And that's on the industry. The industry has not done a good enough job of being inclusive. And, you know, sports are also repetitive. I mean, when I was covering them, you know, you go to a game, you do your stuff, you turn it around. It's all scheduled ahead of time. So you know that stuff. But that also should give you the freedom to be able to go off the schedule and dig into those issues more. And I would really like to see more of that.
So this webinar series is about the 2020 election, and Troy alluded to this earlier. You know, what is all of this going to mean with regard to the election? I wonder if we could hear from each of you just very briefly. You don't necessarily need to make a prediction so much as just kind of tell us what you think that these issues about sports and social justice and social activism might mean for the 2020 elections. Troy, you want to begin?
Sure. I'm really happy you haven't asked me to make a prediction. So I think we're seeing professional teams, perhaps at the behest of the athletes that make up. So the Black self-identifying athletes that make up the majority of their athletes are having an impact on what teams do. So for instance, the NFL, the NBA, we're seeing now these teams are facilitating drive-in registration. They're placing ballot boxes. They're using their arenas and stadiums as polling locations. They're paying their staff for November 3rd for the full day to be able to go vote without having to worry about a paycheck. And all of this really kind of came about at the insistence of NBA and to some extent NFL players, right? At the same time, the numbers that I see, the decline in positive reception for Black Lives Matter and criminal justice makes me a little bit concerned, right? At one hand, I believe that people of color, in particular African Americans, Black people, are very much interested and motivated to make a difference, the ones that vote. On the other hand, I'm wondering if the public is still as inspired by what we saw this summer to actually go to the ballot.
Thanks, Jevon. Lori, any thoughts as far as the implications for the election season?
I think that what has happened definitely motivated a lot of my personal friends, because I can only speak from my experiences, and it's motivated me and my personal friends and their friends, our peers among us, to get into our first presidential election. This is my first time. I have my voters pamphlet actually right next to me, so it's new, but it's needed in light of what has happened and how things have been handled this past 7 months. I think that it's given a lot of positive motivation to people that usually might not have that. So that's my stance.
Great.
Ditto to all of that, yes. I think that one of the important things that might happen about this is just who votes. I think the focus on voting in a time when it's been being made more difficult to vote is hugely important. I think young people, well, I know young people have not turned out in large numbers. As one colleague of mine says, look, you should go vote even though nobody's talking to you anyhow, because they don't think that your generation is voting. If I'm correct on this, I think, Jevon, but didn't UO make sure that all of its athletes are registered to vote? Wasn't there some kind of that kind of movement where you're getting young people who are excited about this, who are sports fans, who are looking at it, who are hearing about LeBron's organization, who are hearing the WNBA stand up every time and say, go vote, fill out your census form, do that can be rolling over again. And I hope that that's reflected in voter turnout when we start to really look at that you're going to start to see more young people voting. And I think a lot of that would be directly attributable to the influence of athletes and sports leagues.
And to add to that, we're seeing that happening with the professional sports as well. So for instance, with the NBA, roughly 85% of all of their athletes have registered to vote. In 2016, that was not the case.
And if I could pull that back too for a second, one of the things is that with the media being so non-diverse for a long time, you tend to mostly hear from white journalists and from white columnists, because so many of them are there. Dr. Lewis Moore, who does wonderful work from the perspective of the Black press through the years, has a quote from Clyde Harrison, who wrote for a Black newspaper in Philadelphia after the '68 Black Power protest. And he was writing about Carlos and Smith, and he said, "It is not enough to shout defiant words, to raise black gloved fists. The battle must be carried to the ballot box where the country's most vital races are won and lost." And it really struck me when I was preparing for this panel to hear those words from an African-American sports columnist from 1968. And I just really feel like this is a moment where we're starting to see that realized.
Yeah, and
Great. Well, go ahead.
one final point, last thing, I think the challenge, and I didn't articulate this very well, but the challenge is to get Black men in particular, young Black men out to cast a ballot. That's a major sort of challenge that we're faced with right now. And that's not a partisan take, that's everyone, just in general.
Yeah. Excellent. This has been fantastic. I want to pitch it over to Nicole for questions that we've received. And I'm sure there's lots of interesting questions for us to continue to answer.
Yes, we have some excellent questions that have come in during the panel for each of you, and a lot of them follow up on some of these issues that we've been discussing. So Jevon, let me turn to you first. Your name appears in the sports pages and in other sections across the news media a lot. So how do you think journalists are doing in covering these issues? And what are some questions that you think journalists should be asking you and others that they aren't asking?
Wow, I've never really got that question. I think they're doing a pretty good job. They're asking me what my views are, and I basically just tell them my opinion because that's all I can tell them. And they do a good job of articulating that, not really putting words in my mouth or anything like that. Man, what questions should they be asking? I think a lot of reporters should ask, like, what are they not seeing? Like, you know what I mean? How am I not portraying certain situations? Like, it's hard to explain, but just seeing it, like, I'll say I'm scrolling on Twitter, right? And so I see the kid that had the AR and that killed somebody. It says, troubled teen, yada, 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 right? He's a troubled teen. But say if it was a Black man in the same situation, it would be a dangerous thug, or, you know what I mean? His the picture of the Black man would be a mugshot, or a picture with him in a hoodie, he's looking suspicious. But a picture of the white kid would be him with his family or him smiling. You know what I mean? That's all. That's what I'm getting from your question, is how, what can they do to kind of even the playing field, which is kind of a weird way to say it, but it's kind of, it's true though, it's yeah.
Right. You're talking about how we cover issues is equally as important as what we cover in regard to the issue itself. Absolutely. So Laurie, picking up on that, you mentioned that a lot of sports journalism tends to cover, the schedule and the stats, right? So how do we see these issues move from the sports pages to, say, section A of the newspaper? And what can all the young journalists out there this evening be doing to prepare themselves to cover these important issues in sports reporting?
So I want to be clear, first of all, I need to know what the schedule is, and I need to know what the depth chart are. We can do them all. We can multitask. I feel very confident that we can do that. How do we do that? Can you say the end of it again? Because you said something I wanted to pick up on.
Right. So there's a lot of, young journalists in the audience this evening. How can they become prepared to be really depth sports reporters and cover, as you say, the stats and the substance outside of the playing field?
Yeah, I think they can do what Colin Kaepernick did, and they can study. They can read some of these, some of these histories. They can understand, they can talk to veterans, they can talk to athletes. I mean, you should do a lot of work before you do your stories. Like, we tend to just interview somebody or do a quick piece of research and do that. But, reading and watching documentaries and thinking about that stuff, I honestly think many times that the most important classes that journalism students take are gen eds, because those are the places where you're introduced to these ideas. And, I would take ethnic studies classes. I would take, I would listen to that stuff and studying for it and asking questions and not assuming, knowing some of these pieces exactly the same way, how a race is run, or the strategy, or the line splits or something. Like, you should know this stuff just as well. That should be a part of your job. And, if you're here in the SOJC, or if you're at the University of Oregon, this is the time to do it. Like, this is when you get the chance to read and watch movies and talk about that stuff. And I think that's hugely important. And I think it should be considered part of your job. I think if you don't know that stuff, if you're covering sports right now and you're not familiar with the history of Black Lives Matter, with the history of protests, with Jackie Robinson, with looking back at all that stuff, you need to go learn it because it's really important.
And Troy, a similar question from you. We have a lot of advertising and public relations students with us this evening who are asking questions about what can brands be doing and how do we become authentic in these types of campaigns versus disingenuous?
For one thing, they can expand the breadth of their campaigns. Mm-hmm. So, March 1st doesn't have to mean the end of outreach to Black communities, right? At the end of summer, when all of the societal unrests are calming down, it doesn't mean that you, for instance, start filming the show Cops again, right? Or it really involves a concerted effort beyond just sort of the window dressing that we are so accustomed to seeing right now, right?
Mm-hmm. That's great. So going back to you, Jevon, you have a lot of fans in the audience tonight who are thanking you for everything that you've done. And a lot of people want to know what's next for you in regard to activism for you.
For me, at this point, I'm just gonna, keep trying to use my voice to speak up. That's, keep educating myself. And then once I get to a place where I'm able to, I want to be able to establish much like football camps, but camps where I can go and educate young men, young women who might not have the opportunity to learn these things in school, learn these things from their parents who may be, out at work all the time, stuff like that. So educational camps, you could say.
I think you should invite sports journalists aspiring and some PR and ad people too, Jevon. It sounds like we could all work together.
Bring them all. That sounds great.
So, Jevon, you touched on this earlier, but as you said, you're voting for the first time in the presidential election, as are many of our University of Oregon students, because they're eligible to vote for the first time. But at the same time, many young people feel completely turned off and disgusted by politics and the political process. So what guidance or thoughts do you have for young people like yourself?
I would say for you to think for yourselves and not to be swayed by what social media says. Just go and do the research yourself, because if you go and educate yourself, then you'll develop your own opinion. And then from there, you'll have a more well-rounded decision, and you won't, get to the point where you're just bubbling in whatever. So go educate yourself, and then, you'll thank me later. Awesome.
So Laurie, we have some questions too about female athletes. Megan Rapinoe's name came up and you mentioned the WNBA. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more, and have any of these social justice protests considered women's issues specifically?
Women's issues specifically, that's interesting. I don't know that they're framed that way exactly. I mean, this just gets right at the heart of intersectionality, right? Where you have, especially in the WNBA, I think you see this very clearly. You have Black women, you have lesbian women, you have, and they're women, right? So these are three groups that are underrepresented in the news media, underrepresented in a lot of powerful rooms where power is held, and they're at the intersection of all that. So I really feel like in a lot of ways, the WNBA, which doesn't get a lot of coverage compared to these other sports, is really at the forefront of how things are happening. The NBA got a lot of publicity for its social justice council. The WNBA had it first. And I think that if you look at that you would see that this is just part of their lives. In a way, I mean, over and over again, if you read the coverage of the NBA, you see WNBA players saying, I can't not say anything. This is my life every single day. And I think that's really on the front end of that. You see a lot less of it because part of it is being able to use your voice in a place where you're getting noticed. And because women's sports are not covered the same way that men's sports are, you just don't have as big of a platform at times. And so that makes a little bit of a difference. There's also additional issues on the women's side, particularly maternity leave, particularly fertility, a lot of that sort of thing. Again, the WNBA is at the forefront in its latest collective bargaining agreement, and that is pressure from athletes in a different way. So it's a strange thing. It's like it's working in concert, and then there's this kind of separate piece that you don't see as much of. I would also point out that behind the scenes, the head of the, I believe I'm correct on this, the head of the NBA Players Association is a Black woman. And she actually, so there's women behind the scenes who you're not necessarily seeing, who are doing some exceptional work to lift a lot of these issues out to the forefront. But certainly more coverage needs to be there.
So we have a question about international impact, and we're starting to see some international leagues across the globe participate in sports activism. Has the US been a role model for that in terms of what our athletes here have done?
I think internationally, I think you see a little bit more of it in the Olympic movement that gets hugely complicated. At least that's what we see in our media here in the United States, unless you're one of those people, and I'm sure there's some of them on this webinar up at 3 o'clock in the morning watching Premier League or whatever else is going on. So I think you see a lot of that in the Olympics, which is a whole other set of weird restrictions and rules and other pieces that are going on. So I think something to look for is the 2021 Olympics now, I guess is what you call it, and whether there are going to be rule changes that allow people to have that happen. And again, you know, the Olympics come up with this internationally a lot, and, you know, oh, keep politics out of this. Well, the Olympics were built on politics. Baron Pierre de Coubertin did not have to make it by country. By setting up the Olympics that way, he set it up in a way that made it inherently political from the very beginning. And so to try to take that out now and tell people they don't have a voice seems very odd. You know, I don't follow enough of the European leagues to be able to see that, but I think you're starting to see pieces of it.
Just to add to that, I think, you know, the European soccer leagues are really well known for the racist taunts that Black soccer players face, right? And I think, you know, one of America's greatest exports is Black culture, and that goes with activism too, right? I think people across the world see this and recognize, hey, we can have a voice and we can have an impact if we stand together and speak out on things that are socially wrong.
So we have one final question for all three of you this evening, and it'll also give you the opportunity for any closing remarks. So what can allies be doing? Let's go to you first, Jevon.
I think allies in all aspects can definitely educate themselves. I say that a lot because that is, you know, the basis of what we do, is trying to educate ourselves to be better people. Mm-hmm. And ask somebody, you know, that looks like, one topic of Black people, ask a Black person what it is like to be a Black person in America and how they might need help from them, or, you know, what help looks like. Don't be afraid to speak up and voice your opinion if it goes against, you know, your families or your peers, because in the end, it's going to come back in good, positive, you know, energy to you. So definitely say educate yourself and don't be afraid to speak up.
I think you can vote. I think you can fill out your census form. I think that, you know, I mean, what's really this gets to, you know, listening to Jevon and this whole conversation is like, what does being a citizen mean? What does being a part of this community mean? And one of the reasons that sports are so important to a society is that they bring us together as a community. And to treat these moments not as us versus them, you know, whoever us and them may be, but as here's a chance to learn from each other. And you know what, we're all Duck fans, we're all, I'm just going to randomly say Pittsburgh Steeler fans, you know, whatever you are, and to look at each other together and realize that you are part of a greater community that has something to be done, and then not to automatically dismiss something. I think it's very easy to automatically dismiss, and I think that we should all resist that urge.
Troy?
Allyship is a verb. It's not a noun. It's an active process. It involves learning. It involves relearning. It involves participating. It involves getting stuff wrong and correcting yourself and coming back again and being persistent and committed to change. And I think all of those things really, as well as, again, educating yourself, all of those things really embody what we think of, or most people of color think of when they think of, you know, an ally.
Well, thank you to our panelists this evening for an excellent discussion, and thank you for all of you out there who joined us this evening. We hope that you found it enlightening. As I mentioned earlier, this has been recorded and it will be available to you to watch on YouTube. Our next conversation is a week from tonight, Monday evening at 5 p.m., and we're going to focus on gender, race, and identity, specifically related to the 2020 election. We also hope that you will help to spread the word about this series. As you all know, we're living at a moment where politics has become so divisive. Politics appears to be broken from time, and the conversation is so chaotic. So we hope that our discussions in this series will help us to have some more meaningful conversations and have some dialogue around these shared sets of insights and lessons, as well as practical solutions. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you next Monday evening.